So welcome everybody. Thanks to everybody for coming to a Secure IT 360 webinar. This is extracting maximum value from offensive security testing. We're going to be talking about assume breach, and I have put a poll in the webinar to see if anyone have heard of assume breach. I think a lot of people probably have, but maybe some people in the audience who are joining this webinar maybe have not heard of assume breach before. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm just curious to get a pulse, to get a litmus test to see where everybody's at on that. So I'm seeing 88% yes. And I'm going to advance my slide. So have you heard of assume breach before? Cool. 90% says yes. Okay, great. I think, so I asked this question in a webinar a year ago maybe? And I asked this question at events like LegalSec, and it was much lower. So I'm glad to see that we're seeing kind of a bigger rise in awareness of this, because it's something we really believe in. Awesome, cool. So back here. All right, so what if there were critical vulnerabilities in your environment right now that your vulnerability scanners have not found? Right? What if you have 5,000, 4,000, 6,000 vulnerabilities that get generated from your Nessus scan or your vulnerability scanner, right? Qualys, whatever. You have so many vulnerabilities. But imagine if there were critical vulnerabilities in your environment right now that those scanners didn't find, right? That's essentially the question that assume breach answers. And we're going to talk about that. So assume breach uncovers vulnerabilities that matter. And we're going to talk about vulnerabilities that matter. You're going to hear me say that over and over and over again. And we're going to get to what that is in this webinar. We're going to cover what that means, what that looks like, and the value that that provides to your security program. Quick little introduction about myself. I've been in IT and security for a while now. I've been using computers and kind of working with computers for a while now. Started in IT help desk and then eventually got into security and now pen testing. Assume breach is really my jam. If anybody here on the webinar knows me or has seen some of my content, you know that I'm a big fan of Windows. I love Active Directory and PowerShell, and assume breach is really my bread and butter, so to speak. It's what I focus on day in and day out. I also contributed to tools and do a lot of fun stuff in the community. And overall, I really just am super passionate about helping organizations secure their environments. And like it says there, just being a little bit more secure today than you were yesterday. So before we dig into assume breach, what that is, what it entails, I think it makes sense to talk about what the current cybersecurity landscape looks like. What are the current threats we're facing today? So today, we have increased attacks, right? Attacks are not only increasing in volume, they're increasing in sophistication. And, when we look at things like MoveIt and we look at some of the other major big breaches that have hit the news, a lot of those happen, they start from 0 days, right? Unknown vulnerabilities in systems that threat actors find and abuse on mass scale, right? MoveIt affected 2,000 plus organizations. We see that ransomware is continuing to be a serious threat. And, not all ransomware attacks are sophisticated, quote unquote, but, the attacks are increasing, right? They're not slowing down by any means. And it says there, the leak sites, if you track some of the leak sites, they are increasing as well. The amount of victims announced on those leak sites is increasing. And, ransomware groups like Clop and others are not slowing down anytime soon. And on that same note, on the flip side of the coin, even though we're seeing an increase in volume and an increase in sophistication, we're still seeing very low sophisticated attacks, right? Credential stuffing, password spraying, social engineering. When you look at Okta, when you look at MGM and things like that, we see that these attacks are happening a lot of times because of very rudimentary attacks. This is not anything super sophisticated. Essentially password guessing. A lot of these comes down to. And what that comes down to, or what that translates to me, is an increased focus on best practices, right? Uh, the blocking and tackling, right? Um, there's an increased demand, or there's an increased focus on kind of doing the basics well, so that we can prevent some of the basic type of attacks like password spraying and social engineering, right? There's also an emphasis on avoiding the blinky box syndrome. And what I mean by that, and we've probably all heard that, is, we have this shiny tool, like the tool is going to save us, or the tool is going to be 100% effective everywhere. And we kind of get misled by a lot of the modern marketing and kind of the buzzwords that are happening, right? Just implement zero trust, or we have 100% protection. We get focused on these kind of misrepresented claims, and it kind of detracts from the real mission of securing our organization. Same thing goes with vulnerability scanning, right? We have 5,000 vulnerabilities. Can't possibly patch those all. We can't possibly remediate all those. But yet IT teams are burdened to kind of just increase or decrease that number, and get it closer and closer to zero, when there are other vulnerabilities that are way more important, way more serious in the environment, like I said at the beginning, that your vulnerability scanners are just not finding. There's also a growing importance on proactive layer defense. And what I mean by that is having multiple controls, multiple layers in succession in order to prevent or mitigate an attack, right? Just like a castle, I think, is a great illustration of that. And it just points to the silver bullet solutions are not sufficient, right? EDR alone is not enough. Antivirus alone is not enough, right? No single control, no single defense is going to be enough to protect your organization. It will definitely stop very run-of-the-mill, rudimentary type things. It will prevent a lot of stuff. But when we're talking about a holistic security program, it's just not enough to rely on one thing alone. And the same goes for security assessments, right? Um, you shouldn't rely just on pen testing, or just security audits, or just compliance assessments. Having proactive layer defense means you're doing multiple types of security assessments, including various types of penetration testing. And that gets us to the point of penetration testing, and kind of the point of this webinar is there's a difference between traditional network penetration testing and assume breach. And this webinar obviously is focused on assume breach, and we're going to kind of talk through what traditional network penetration testing looks like, what are some of the drawbacks of that, and how it's different from assume breach. So the challenges of traditional internal pen testing, internal network pen testing. So, you can raise your hand or type in chat if you've had a pen test before and it kind of sounded like something like this. The pen test firm will send you a Kali attack machine, right? A Dropbox or a VM or something like that. You'll plug it into your network, and that's more or less how the pen test starts, right? It starts unauthenticated with maybe just access to the network. It usually starts without credentials, usually starts with, very little information or knowledge about the environment or accounts or anything like that. And it starts unauthenticated. And that's very different from a traditional attack, right? A traditional attack is going to be somebody gets social engineered, or somebody clicks on something, they download a piece of malware, and now that threat actor has initial access. That threat actor is going to try to move laterally. They're going to try to elevate their privileges. They're going to try and encrypt things, deploy ransomware. They're going to try and exfil data. And then they're going to, put it on a leak site and try and do extortion and things like that. That looks very different from a traditional network pen test, where we're just plugging a device into the network, right? A lot of times when we talk to clients, we say, threat actors are not going to be emailing you a USB with Kali on it. Although, sometimes, threats like that happen, and that's a real thing. Very low likelihood that a threat actor is going to send you a Kali machine that's got a whole bunch of attack tools on it and ask you to plug it into the network. So we've got this dichotomy of security assessments here. The other challenge is traditional network pen testing, is really focused on coverage. How many vulnerabilities can we find in the time limited engagement that we have? We're looking for all of the bad things in the environment. We're not necessarily focused on impact of any specific vulnerability. We're just trying to take a wide breadth approach to it to find as much as we can in that time. We're also, you know, not necessarily focused on exploitability during an internal network pen test or a traditional network pen test. And, traditionally network pen testing or pen testing in general is focused on exploitation, right? However, with so many vulnerabilities to look at, when you look at Nessus and you look at other scanners, there's a tremendous amount of vulnerabilities to go through in that amount of time, and you kind of lose sight of the exploitability nature of it. So that contrasts assume breach, and we'll see what that looks like here in a minute. But the point is, we're looking at coverage versus impact. Wide coverage on a traditional network pen test versus impact on assume breach. And kind of the last point on the security landscape is a lot of traditional network pen testing finds known knowns. We find vulnerabilities that we know exist in the environment because our scanners are looking for those things as well. And it's not really testing things that IT and security teams want tested, right? A lot of times, you might be thinking, is my EDR working? Is my antivirus working? Or my MDR going to notify me of a threat in my environment? If an attacker gets on a machine and they're able to move laterally in the environment, or if they're, enumerating all of the SMB shares in the environment, the file shares, is that something that I'm going to be able to detect and prevent and stop it? Is my Active Directory configured good? Are there misconfigurations in my Active Directory that, allow IT help desk to be domain admins, for example? Is there a breakdown in my tier to admin model, which is very common? So there's all these things that, vulnerability scanners aren't going to find, but IT security teams want tested. So we have this challenge with traditional network pen testing, and that's where assume breach comes in. So yeah, as the webinar shows, we think assume breach is a better way. It's a more realistic representation of threats on your environment. So the assume breach approach, assume breach. So we assume that a user is going to get compromised, right? I think we all can agree on that. We assume a system is going to get compromised. And the way Secure IT 360 does it, the way we do it, is we start with initial access on an endpoint, which is very common, right? You give the pen test firm, you give the attacker, quote unquote, access to an endpoint. And what we like to do is we like to start on a domain join system with a domain user account. So we like to essentially log into that computer just like a typical user would. And we think that's a more realistic representation for a couple reasons, right? We have remote users, we have third-party vendors that access our system, and we have threat actors that could, social engineer a user, send them malware. Now there's, a piece of malware running on their machine and they have access to that. And it focuses on vulnerabilities that matter, which is vulnerabilities that have true impact to the organization, right? Like I said at the beginning, Nessus finds 8,000 vulnerabilities. On assume breach engagement, we might have 10, 20 vulnerabilities that actually present, serious risk to the organization. They're not just, you're missing a certificate on RDP, right? And the goal of assume breach really is to answer the question of, or to find unknown unknowns. It's to answer that question. What are the unknown unknowns in my environment that could be posing serious risk? And again, we say this all the time, and I think it's intuitive, but I think it's worth repeating, is the goal is not domain admin. The goal is not to just fully compromise the domain, add ourselves to the domain admin group, and then we're done. The goal is to show impact, right? Can we go from a low privilege user, a non-admin, and get access to a database server that's got data on it, or get access to a share or a document management system that has data on it? So the assume breach approach, one thing I want to mention is there are differences, right? When you go to different firms, they're going to have a different approach. Sometimes assume breach is kind of considered a red team with seated access, right? It's kind of a mini red team, or a red team where you just give them access and then that's how it starts. Others call it a pen test, right? It's more of a pen test where you're looking for vulnerabilities, not just kind of the path to compromise the environment. That's the second approach, is kind of the approach I like to take. And when we go through kind of the value that it provides and kind of what the common findings are, I'm going to describe what that means and what that looks like a little bit more. But I like to take the approach of pen testing, assume breach being a pen test, where you're given access as a regular domain user, and you kind of see what you can do from there. What it's not, and I like to mention this, is it's not a vulnerability assessment, right? We're not trying to find as many vulnerabilities as we can. It's not a purple team where we're going to just assess whether we're detected or not. And it's not a threat emulation where we're going to perform specific attacker TTPs, like take APT 101 or whatever the APT is, and run those exact commands. It's not a threat emulation, but it does pull aspects of that. I think that's one of the benefits of Assume Breach is it kind of pulls a little bit of everything into this engagement and provides kind of a very well-rounded approach. And it kind of leads to other assessments, which is great, which is the next slide. I'm jumping ahead of myself, but it kind of leads to other assessments. So the benefits Assume Breach. What I'm going to describe is kind of how we like to do it. So when you go to another firm, they might not look at the endpoint as much. They might not look at other things as much. But if you get an Assume Breach engagement from us, an internal Assume Breach pen test from us, this is what you can kind of expect and what it looks like. And there's a reason for that. The first thing is endpoint evaluation. As we know, all of users are using an endpoint, right? It might be Windows, it might be Mac, it might be a virtual desktop with like VMware or VDI or Citrix or something like that. But everybody's using an endpoint, right? They're logging into a computer. That computer has software on it, has browsers, it has all the things that Windows would have, task scheduler and PowerShell, and it has group policies that are applied. All of these things our attack surface, right? So once I get initial access, those things are all attack surface in the environment. And those are all things that I can use or abuse as a threat actor. So the very first distinction about how we like to do assume breach pen testing is looking at the endpoint, looking how well it's configured, how well it's hardened, and looking at the security settings. So I look at scheduled tasks. A lot of scheduled tasks are misconfigured such that you can, add yourself or modify a folder where that scheduled task is being run, and then you can potentially elevate your privileges. We look at services, installed software. There's been a number of engagements that I've been on where the software has been installed insufficiently or insecurely that allowed me to elevate my privileges as a non-administrator on that machine. And in a few slides from now, I'm going to show kind of some common findings that you'll see on an internal assume breach pen test and what those look like to hopefully drive home the point of the value that this type of assessment provides. Also with endpoint evaluation, we look at group policies that are applied. There's been a number of engagements again where group policies have deployed files, like it's been configured to install software. Well, that software was living on file shares that were misconfigured that allow me to manipulate it, and a whole host of other things. PowerShell is a big attack vector still. PowerShell with the advent of AMZ and logging, script block logging, a lot of those things, it's been harder to use PowerShell from an attack perspective, but we still see threat actors using it all the time, right? If you're familiar with the DFIR report, almost everyone, you're going to see PowerShell use in some way, shape, or form in those reports. Labs, WSUS, SCCM, these are all things to harden and configure endpoints, and those are many times misconfigured. And there's a number of things that we look at in the endpoint evaluation portion of the engagement. And when I talk to clients, I like to call it a 120-point inspection, right? It's you get your car inspected, 120-point inspection. I like to think of it like that because we're trying to go through everything on that endpoint to see, is there anything that we can abuse to elevate our privileges, to move laterally, to otherwise, abuse the system, obtain persistence, whatever the case may be. We want to see, can that endpoint be abused and how hardened is it against attack? So that's step number one for us, is that endpoint evaluation. Step number two, second component of our internal assume breach pen test methodology is the Active Directory network portion. So as we know, most organizations are using Active Directory, and even more so, most organizations are using Entra, and they have a bunch of stuff on the network, right? They have printers, they have cameras, maybe there is other IoT devices. There's a whole host of things that are listening on the network that have an IP address, and there's this big thing called Active Directory. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on, I guess, what side of the fence you're on, Active Directory doesn't necessarily come out of the box secured and configured in a hardened way, right? There's a lot of ways that Active Directory is kind of insecure by default, unfortunately. So as part of our internal assume breach pen test, we're looking for those things. We're doing another, 120 point inspection on Active Directory. We're going to look at security groups and service accounts. We're going to look at delegation, right? We're going to see, are their permissions configured for a group of users that allow them to do something bad or something that could allow regular users to elevate their privileges or to abuse those security settings. So Active Directory is a big component of this as well, as is the network, right? We want to find all of those mistakes and misconfigurations and bring those to light so that those can be addressed. Now, the interesting thing about Active Directory in this case is a lot of organizations have certificate services, which is something I'm very familiar with. And that in itself also can be secured or insecurely configured by default. And there's a number of things that you can get wrong with Active Directory. There's a lot of moving parts. And I've said this in other presentations, but Active Directory, is an admin, it's an admin console, right? You go to Active Directory users and computers, or ADUC, right? And it's an administrative console. It's not necessarily configured in a way that supports securing it appropriately, right? If I have a security group called IT Help Desk and I add it to domain admins, it's not going to warn me. And that's one of the drawbacks with Active Directory, right? Is it doesn't necessarily warn you when there's mistakes being made. So it's hard, it's difficult to manage it. It requires expertise, and there's a lot can go wrong with it. The third big kind of component of our internal assume breach pen test process or methodology is security monitoring, right? And if you remember a couple slides back, I said it's not a vulnerability assessment. Assume breach is not a purple team, and it's not a threat emulation. But you can see there's components of that are pulled to make this assessment work, right? So security monitoring. A lot of IT and security teams want to know: is my EDR going to alert if curb roasting is detected or password spraying? Is my MDR going to let me know if there's some threat actor using or abusing PowerShell in my environment to do bad things, right? Maybe or another example is my EDR or MDR service going to let me know if somebody's trying to obtain credentials or like dump credentials from the endpoint? All these things IT and security teams want to know about, and they want to know so they can address them, put in alerts, fix those gaps, and really improve the security of their environment. And like it says, if something goes bump on the network, will we know about it? And I think that's also a big component of this assume breach engagement. Again, we're not trying to be a silver bullet. We're trying to give a wide assessment. And like I said, a lot of these points I'm making, you can kind of see how these components of the assumed breach can lead to other types of assessments. The security monitoring specifically can lead to purple team engagements, right? So maybe during the course of the internal pen test, we identify that, hey, EDR, MDR, or whatever that you have for security isn't really alerting you in the way you would like, or it's not alerting you to the things that you think are important. Well, it might be a good idea at that point to do some more evaluation of that and figure out, what exactly am I getting alerts on? What am I not? So maybe that leads to a purple team, or maybe it leads to another type of assessment that can help you kind of hone in on what's wrong in your environment. So security monitoring evaluation is a really big component of this as well. And again, the whole goal here is focusing on vulnerabilities that matter to attackers. And what I mean by that is the vulnerabilities that matter to attackers, they matter to IT and security teams, right? They should matter to us as well when we're testing, right? If a threat actor isn't going to abuse, 47% or 58% or 95% of the vulnerabilities that Nessus spit out, why are we focusing on those during pen testing? So really the goal of Assume Breach is identify the vulnerabilities that matter to attackers, which means they matter to us. So we want to look for those, identify those, bring those to light, and offer remediations and mitigations for those. And like I said a couple times, but this is a great segue into scenario-based testing, threat emulation, things like that, where you have done your internal pen test. Now you want to, start from point A and you want to see if you can get to point B. And maybe that's, well, I want to start on this web server that's in a DMZ, and I want to see if we can get to, this isolated server on another network somewhere else that has, all of the secrets in it. This is a great segue into that type of testing. Once you've gone through the internal pen test, assume breach process, and you've remediated all those vulnerabilities, you kind of eliminated a lot of the low-hanging fruit. That's a good next step. So common findings. What I want to share now is kind of the core argument for Assume Breach and why I enjoy doing Assume Breach so much and why I think it provides so much value to organizations. So I'm going to kind of articulate that through a couple things that I think will drive home the point of kind of each component of the internal Assume Breach assessment. When we look at endpoint evaluation, Active Directory in the network, and security monitoring, we're going to talk through a couple of those that you might be familiar with, or maybe you're not familiar with, and kind of describe the value that Assume Breach provides because of the vulnerabilities that we can find with it. So the first thing is, how many people check for vulnerabilities and misconfigurations after they install a new piece of software, right? If you're an IT admin or you're in charge of security in an organization, you deploy a new piece of software. Are you checking that? Are you checking to see if it has a service and if that service has correct permissions? Are you checking the permissions in program files when it gets installed? Are you looking for log files that might have credentials in them? Things like that. So this, again, is the value that Assume Breach provides. Because we're doing an endpoint evaluation, we're looking for those things. We're looking for insecurely installed software. And what that might look like is software that's installed on the root of the C drive, misconfigured permissions, or misconfigured service permissions. So if you install a piece of software and for some reason it gives everyone the ability to manipulate that service, well, now I, as a non-admin, can just replace that service with my malicious one, and now I'm off to the races. Running services as privileged users, that's another common issue that we see. A lot of times it's on servers, right? You have a SQL admin account that's in domain admins, and it's running the SQL account on a SQL server. That's very common to see, and it does just work, but that's probably a little bit more privileges than that account needs or that service needs. We see modifiable programs all the time, and really the kind of core of this kind of group of issue is it leads to privilege escalation and could also lead to lateral movement and persistence, right? So if I, as an attacker, can get administrative level access, then I can do more damage on the network and I can move around in the network and pivot to other machines, most likely. Other common misconfigurations that we see on endpoints are the spooler service on domain controllers. Many times in small offices, firms that have satellite offices, they have a domain controller in that office, and then that domain controller is also the print server and the file server, right? It's got shares on it. And because the spooler service is running on it, that adds increased risk to the environment. Is that spooler service can be used to coerce authentication, it's called. So I can trick the domain controller into authenticating, and I could potentially steal that authentication and use that to elevate my privileges. And there's a number of things, I don't have to read them all on the slide, But the point is, there's a number of things that can go wrong in the endpoints, and more often than not, on every single internal assume breach pen test that we do, we find some sort of misconfiguration on these endpoints. Another common one, non-unique local admin passwords. VNC is that's running on all the endpoints, and there's a number of things that can go wrong with endpoints, and that's why I'm so focused on doing that evaluation, so that we get that right, so that we secure those endpoints from attack. So raise your hand if you could probably guess where there might be unsecured credentials in your environment, right? So we're kind of moving off of the endpoint, right? We're getting into the network side of things, network Active Directory side of things. So unsecured credentials. This is one of those network-based findings that we see all the time. And, they're on endpoints as well, but predominantly we're looking at file shares, we're looking at logon scripts, we're looking at document management systems, we're looking at SharePoint and Dropbox and OneDrive. Anywhere you have a document repository, right? We want to look in to see if users are storing credentials there. And more often than not, we find users putting credentials in files like password.txt or password.doc or these are my passwords.xlsx, and part of this is user education and part of this is kind of IT administration and hygiene. But this is something that is very common. And believe it or not, if you read the reports and the data breaches, this is how a lot of organizations kind of get attacked once an attacker has initial access. You look at some of the big breaches, they got access to credentials that were in file shares in a lot of cases. And so unsecured credentials is something we focus on a lot because oftentimes there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we can capture and document during the engagement and say, hey, we found all these credentials, go and clean those up. And then we give you a strategy to say, hey, once a quarter, go out, look for these. Just manually go out to File Explorer, go to your document management system and just look for passw or password and just kind of search for those. And that's a good way to start. Another good way to start is just using PowerShell. If you are good with scripting and kind of whip something up real quick, you can just write a PowerShell script to go out to all your shares and search for certain strings where users might have credentials, like password and credential and login and things like that. So those are the first two ways I would recommend starting, and you can do those for free. Those are very easy to get started with. But unsecured credentials is something that is very common. It's on pretty much every report that we do. The other thing I want to call attention to is Pingcastle. Some of you on this call might be familiar with this tool. It's essentially an Active Directory health assessment tool. I use it quite often during engagements, and it really is great for finding a lot of low-hanging fruit, a lot of misconfigurations in Active Directory, and kind of showing you kind of the step-by-step, more or less, what's wrong, how to fix it, where to go to get additional information about it. So it's very great. It's a really good tool and it's free. You can run in your environment right now. And I went the wrong direction. So misconfigured Active Directory. Again, Pingcastle is great at finding those misconfigurations, finding those issues. Everything that I'm going to mention in this webinar from an Active Directory standpoint, for the most part, Pingcastle can find. So insecure ACLs, this is where, for example, the everyone group in Active Directory or domain users, essentially all the users in the environment have full control to domain admins, let's say, which is, really bad. That means users would be able to reset passwords or modify the group itself to add additional users, create new users, things like that. So there's a number of things that can go wrong with Active Directory, with permissions and security groups and things like that. I mentioned group policies earlier. Group policies is another one that is kind of a beast, right? You have, big organizations have a lot of group policies, and they're very itemized, which is great. But you end up having a ton of group policies to manage, right? And it's not easy to kind of get it right all the time. Service accounts in domain admins. So a lot of times we see in the domain admins group, there are service accounts. Like I mentioned, the SQL admin account, or it might be, a service account for your document management system, things like that. Weak passwords is another one. Obviously, I think that is something everybody can kind of relate to. But there's a number of things that can go wrong with Active Directory. And the great thing is the internal assume breach pen test focuses on that very heavily. So we look at all those things. We look at all of the components of Active Directory that could possibly be wrong. And we try to identify the ones that actually provide or that actually present risk to the organization that attackers are going to abuse. Security monitoring. So what we want to know when it comes to security monitoring, are bad things detected at all? Uh, are some of the bad things detected? And out of those bad things, are we getting the alerts that we want to see? Are those actionable alerts? Do they make sense? Do they give us an idea of where to go to look once we get that alert? So the important thing to know about the internal assume breach pen test process is we're going to be conducting attacks. We're going to be performing techniques that threat actors are going to be using. It's not going to be a super sophisticated APT type of threat scenario, but we're going to be using a lot of the common tools that threat actors are going to be using. And we're going to be generating alerts with those. So we're going to be able to test to some extent, how well the EDR is working, how well MDR is working. Are we getting the alerts? Like I said, if there's bad things happening, are you getting the alerts that you're expecting to get? And are those meaningful and actionable? And can you do something about it after the fact? So the key takeaways for assume breach are it's a more effective, efficient way to find vulnerabilities that matter, right? We're starting as a regular user. We're looking at all the things that user could potentially get access to and more. And we're taking the approach of, let's assume that a user is going to get compromised. What could happen if that happens, right? And more accurately represents the typical threat on your network, right? Like I said earlier, a threat actor is not going to send you, a VM that you plug into your network. And it focuses on endpoints, Active Directory, and the network, right? The three kind of main things that can kind of go wrong in your security program, right? The endpoints that users are using, Active Directory and things in the network, and security monitoring. It leads to specific types of assessments. So it might lead to a purple team. It might lead to kind of a more threat specific assessment. And finding these vulnerabilities really helps improve security and improve resilience in your organization. Because like I said, all these vulnerabilities are things that are very easy and very trivial for attackers to take advantage of, which means they're going to meaningfully improve the security of your organization. So with that, I have a number of resources and I have a number of tools that people can use to get started with doing this. This isn't something, a lot of times we call pen testers in for their expertise. And I think that's kind of the value we provide is we provide that expertise of knowing how to abuse these things, knowing where to look, knowing what rocks to turn over, and knowing how to kind of show the impact that those vulnerabilities present. A lot of the tools we use, though, are open source, right? There's a lot of free resources that you can get started with doing this. And I always like to share some resources and some tools that people can use if they're looking to kind of look for some of these vulnerabilities in their environment. So we've got a number of blogs, podcasts that we've done on this topic. And there's a number of free tools that I will share in the next slide about assume breach and kind of some of the tools you can use. And I'll just walk through briefly kind of what some of those are to kind of give a sense of, finding some of these vulnerabilities yourself, finding some of the low-hanging fruit. So Script Sentry, selfish plug, it's a tool I created to find misconfigured logon scripts, find dangerous logon scripts. So a lot of times we'll find credentials in those logon scripts. We'll find that there are shares that no longer exist that are being mounted by logon scripts. Again, I mentioned Pingcastle is a great Active Directory health assessment tool. And Bloodhound is another one that can find a lot of low-hanging fruit very, very easily. Locksmith, it wouldn't be a webinar of mine without calling out Locksmith. It's the best tool for finding misconfigured certificate templates, certificate services, and it even provides you a little snippet or remediation snippet. So say we have this misconfigured template, it will give you a little PowerShell one-liner or a PowerShell command that you can run to fix that issue right away. So there's a lot of people using it. It's a really great tool. And there's a number of other tools that you can use that can find different vulnerabilities in your environment, that can find a lot of this low-hanging fruit. And you can even do this before a pen tester comes in. You fix everything, and then they're having a bad day because there's nothing to attack or poke at. So this stuff is all really good, and recommend checking it out. And if you need help with anything like that, that's what we do. It's our bread and butter. I do assume breach all day, every day. That's kind of what I live and breathe. So if there's anything we can help with, certainly let us know. And thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Everybody coming and listening and watching. I hope you got value from this presentation, and hope to see you again in the next one.